Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So I think a few videos ago, I've shown this little GIF of Kaisen briefly, and I shown a little bit of the progress when I made that video, but you guys probably have been seeing him kind of float around here and there on some of my recent streams as well. So I thought it'd be fun today to kind of do a few more little gifs of my own OCs with kind of like a silly little aspect to them, because this one was just like there was no reason for me to make this, but I had like a little bit of an itch in my brain where I really wanted to draw a Kaisen spinning in a pumpkin for whatever reason. So instead, I thought it'd be fun today to actually make one of two of my OCs. So one is going to be Sato and one is going to be of my OC Moriko. I prefer sketching traditionally a lot of the time, so instead of my iPad, we are going to be cracking open my sketchbook and using that to help brainstorm of ideas that we want to do for our little silly gifts for today. I need to put down a piece of paper in between my pages just to make sure that things don't get pressed or smudged in between while I'm drawing, but in terms of the ideas, I believe one of them was suggested to me during a stream. So someone asked if I could make one of, I believe, Sato in a Christmas tree. So I decided to use that idea. So thank you to whoever suggested that. I really like the idea and it's super cute. I did have a little bit of a difficulty on how I wanted to draw the Christmas tree because chibi heads tend to be super large, and as you get closer to the top of a Christmas tree, it gets a little bit smaller and thinner. So I ended up doing just like a little bit of a Christmas tree shape, and I'm gonna leave kind of like the width or the actual design of the Christmas tree up in the air until we actually start to sketch it on the iPad. The second idea I had was of my OC Moriko, and I don't know why, I really wanted to put like a ribbon in her hair, so I thought it'd be cute to have her as a little gift or a present. So her body will be inside like a little wrapped box, and then she'll have the ribbon or the bow on the top, just kind of like a little present. I just thought it would be super cute and like, I don't know, really adorable. So the little sketches that I ended up doing, so I did kind of like the front facing portion to kind of get the proportions correct so that I knew how to put them inside the said item. The one that you're seeing me do right now is going to be of Kaisen because I think I've mentioned this as well. He's kind of like the OC I like to tease to some degree, so I thought it'd be funny to put him in an ornament where his body will be kind of like the ball shape, but instead of have him spinning, I would have him rolling to the side like perpetually. So my kind of plan is for all of these gifts to continuously loop. So please bear with me as we go through the video. I'm not going to treat this as like a tutorial by any means, so I'm just going to add like little tidbits here and there. But I am not an expert at animation or making GIFs or just making anything look like consistent if you have to draw something like over and over again, so we're going to have to bear with that. But with our little sketches done, I probably will save Kaisen for another time because I might want to make it like a little bit slower and see what I can do with it before I actually commit to it. But for now, let's go ahead and make a new canvas. I decided to stick with the default canvas size on Procreate, so it's just a default square, and I believe that's what I used for Kaisen, so that's what I ended up using for Sato and Moriko's. So in Procreate, they do have an animation assist, so once you turn that on, you have a little timeline on the bottom. You can use add frame to add a new frame, or every new layer that you make will also add a frame to your timeline. You also have a little button on the left-hand side of your timeline to help play your animation, but for now we are going to focus on basically planning out our sketches and our frame sequence. So for Sato's, I have her frame sequence very similar to how I did Kaisen. So I believe I had a front-facing chibi, and then moving towards the left-hand side, because they're going to be turning technically to their right, but visually it'll be turning to the left. So I have it at a front-facing, a 3/4. I think I had sometimes put like another angle before we hit profile, but I think for Sato's and Kaisen, I just did the front 3/4 side profile, back 3/4, and then we have the back, and then we have the flip side for the basically the right hand side of our rotation. So it's not too many frames to do, which I find a little bit easier for making these little small spinning GIFs, I guess. Also, this is when I was trying to deal with whether or not I wanted to make the little Christmas tree kind of like a wooden or cardboard kind of object for her to sit in, and whether or not her hair would show behind, or I would make it similar to, I don't remember if like back during 17's pre-debut when they're in the green room, June used to be dressed up in like a Christmas tree for like a Christmas skit. And I think it's just like a cardboard or fabric little thing that he was standing in. And I don't remember if it's just like covering only the front and like the back, you're just like, the entirety of your human side, I guess, showing. So I was trying to think whether or not I wanted to make it a little bit more three-dimensional, which caused me to have a little bit of an issue with doing like the actual turnaround. Kaisen's was a little bit easier to kind of like almost fake my way to doing his rotation. So all I had to do was make sure that the little curved lines of the pumpkins, like the little divots or like the little bulges, I guess, of the pumpkin would be shifting so that it looks like it's moving in a direction, and around their objects a little bit easier because I would have to focus on making sure the shape is somewhat consistent, and I can use the extra lines in the center or like the inside of the shape to convey whether or not the shape is actually shifting. But for something like this that has like more edges and a three-dimensional shape, my proportions alongside with the perspective of the little box that she's in is gonna look so off. I do apologize, and I should have probably thought this through a little bit more. I do think that during Moriko's, I do put more of an attempt, but there are some frames that I ended up dropping because I got too confused on how many angles I needed to show for the box to spin, which we'll get into in a little bit. So with all my sketches all done for our turnaround, I will go ahead and make a new layer, group them together, and in Procreate with the animation assist on, every group that you make will now become your frames. So this is kind of like an easier way to kind of sort out your line art, your coloring, any effects and stuff you want per frame, instead of having to manage a bunch of layers or trying to do everything on one layer, because I think that's not really going to work out for a lot of people if you wish to do lines, colors, and sketching all together. So definitely put your frames all into individual folders per frame, so that you can do your line art and your coloring, any shading and all that separately. I brought Kaisen back in so that we can match the same thickness and find the appropriate pen that I ended up using. And I think for the most part, I ended up using the Monoline pen. It just has a very consistent line width, and I ended up putting like a fairly high stabilization, I think. I think it's around 50, between 50 and 60, I think, which gave me enough stabilization to get somewhat clean lines, but not too slow, because sometimes I find the Procreate stabilization a little bit harder to work with. I don't know if it's because of how I'm inking directly on the screen versus like how I used to do line art. I still find it a little difficult to like fully utilize it to its full potential, I guess. But for each of the different frames that I ended up doing the line art for, sometimes I will toggle the onion skin on and off, just to check, because sometimes it just like your sketch just looks too messy. So the kind of like grayish lines on my screen is actually the sketch for the current frame, and then the blue one I believe is my previous frame, and my red one is my next frame. So in Procreate you can adjust your onion skin to show as many levels as you want, but even if you select, I believe, one onion skin, it will be one before and one after, so I will still see multiple different onion skin layers at the same time alongside with the current sketch that I'm working on. So sometimes I will turn it off so that I don't have to look at the next frame's lines or sketches. So I will turn off the opacity in my actual like line folders or whatever you want, like your layers. I guess you would turn them off so that I don't have to see them. I know they're beneficial when you're doing like tweening or kind of making your animation a lot smoother, so you can see the motion of like from point A to point B. Maybe you want to put something like 1.5 in between. You kind of need to see where the first and the next one kind of line up. But I'm not doing anything that's like requiring a lot of animation or anything smooth. We're just making something silly and fun and kind of like easier, if anything, because I think we're working only with like 8 frames here, which is just going to be a very quick turnaround. For coloring, so for each of the individual folders, I will set the line art to be alpha locked first so that I can change the line art color to be a little bit softer for the face, some of the skin lines, and details for the eyes. After that, I will change it also to reference. That way I can drag and drop colors onto a separate layer underneath my line art without having to either first select on my line art layer and then going back to my color layer, dropping in the colors or filling them in. I can just drop the colors like automatically and it will reference my line art because it has the reference layer on, so it makes coloring a lot easier. For shadows and for highlights, shadows I have a kind of like a purple color set to multiply and it's clipped to my color layer. And then for the highlights, I ended up using the screen layer and I used kind of I think a yellow. So probably the yellow base color for the star is what I used for the highlights for everything. So for the coloring stage, I ended up doing all of Sato's base colors and shading and everything, all the colors that I want to use for the actual GIF on the very first frame. Then on Procreate, you can make palettes. So I went to the palette little section in your color window, I guess, which happens to be the last option once you open up your colors, and made a new palette, or in this case, I replaced all the colors in Kaisen's palette so that we have access to everything. I popped the palette out onto the left-hand side of my canvas so I don't have to keep opening up on the kind of like little pop-up window instead. So it's kind of like just floating there every time, and it makes it a lot easier for me to drag and drop colors, also just selecting colors back and forth. It just takes a lot of time if you have to keep opening up a separate menu, so I find it a lot easier this way. So for her shadows, I initially made it so that the light was coming from the upper left. So I was trying to keep in mind to put shadows on the right hand, like the right hand side, and then as well as the highlights closer to the left near the light source. But eventually I will make some changes to the shadows because I ended up dropping a lot of the shadows onto Sato where she's like completely in darkness, which worked for the most part. But it would have worked a lot better if I had more frames in between so that I could have her emerge from the light more naturally instead of having a harsh cut from her being in shadow to the light, which is like the very first frame again, which you can kind of see right here. I believe I will change it so that the shadow on the last frame is not as harsh so that when it transitions back to the first frame, it's just less of a jump. So next is exporting as a GIF. So I went ahead, pressed export, and I realized that there is a transparent background option. Before, I would actually turn off my background layer instead, but I found this option a little bit easier. And here's kind of like the little finished result of the little Satos alongside with one with Kaisen as well. I'll make sure to put them all at the very end if you're interested in seeing them again. But for now, let's go ahead and work on Moriko's. So Moriko's session is going to be a lot more choppier footage because I'm not going to go through every same step that I did for Sato's, but I did spend a little bit more time on hers because a cube I kind of thought would be easier for me to manage in terms of doing a kind of like a turning sequence, I guess. But for some reason, I got super lost because every side became too much the same. So later on, you're going to see that I'm going to have an F on one side and a B on another so that I could differentiate which one was the front and what was the back as soon as it turns back to the front portion that we're looking at. Otherwise, every corner and every angle kind of low-key looks the same. So I tried to make sure to label them so I knew what was in frame, what was not in frame, and then as well tried to include her little foot spinning. So to give a little bit more context, if you saw my initial sketch in my sketchbook, I had Moriko's foot like kicked up, but with their proportions being so tiny and short, I did not know where exactly to put Moriko's knee per se. I technically could have just extended the legs a little bit more or made the box a little bit more rectangular, I guess, to make room for her legs to show. But instead, I ended up having her foot basically stick out at the very back of the box and have her one leg facing just like down, like in almost like a standing ostrich pose, but it doesn't really make sense until she spins so that you can see the second foot. Otherwise, it just looks like she has one leg at this point. And another thing I wanted to talk about, because I think this is going to be very evident when I was doing Sato's as well, is the fact that when I'm doing these little silly animations and stuff that I think are a little bit more on like, the simple side, because I'm not taking in consideration a lot of like certain frames to make things move cleaner, or even lining up things so that it looks like it's turning appropriately, if that makes sense. So in my initial sketch, when I was mapping out all the frames for Moriko's little sequence, her bow changes size so many times that it kind of annoyed me, but I did not have the energy to change it. So I'm going to have to put in the extra work during the line arting phase, which I'm doing right now, and making sure that I can include the bow to be the exact size that I need it to be. And to do this as well, I needed to turn off the extra frames in front. So if we have a sequence of like from bottom to top, I guess we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't even know how many frames we had. I think we have like 11, maybe 12. But I had to turn off all the frames that come after my current frame so that I did not get mixed up with my lines. And I found that it made it a little bit easier for me to make sure that her bow was a little bit more consistently sized when she was turning. And thank God that I did, because otherwise my turning sequence, her bow would have been shrinking both lengthwise across her head and increasing in height when she was turning. So it probably would have looked very wacky, but I think I got it down so that at least it looks like the same ribbon for the most part when she's turning. But back to kind of like the final steps, I went ahead and did all the little color changes for her line art, added a little bit of a secondary color into her eyes so that they're not just pitch black. And then after that, I went ahead and also did the same thing as Sato. So on the first frame, I ended up making her color palette. I replaced a bunch of colors in the palette once again, and then I went back and just started to fill in all the colors. I made an extra layer for the multiply to make the shadows, and made another layer with the screen mode on, and then we could do the highlights. After that, I ended up just, going through every frame, making sure that I changed the appropriate line art to be the reference layer, so it makes dragging and dropping the colors a lot easier. So there's nothing really too different for her sequence, except for that I did end up dropping a few frames here and there. So I believe I ended up adding 2 frames to her turning sequence when she was turning to the left, and I accidentally dropped some frames as she's turning back to the right, I think, as well as like 2 back frames that I did not include, because for some reason I just got super confused on just the placement of the box. So there are parts where when she's turning, it does seem like she's turning a little bit quicker, and that's probably because I dropped some of the frames at some point. But I think this is good enough for exactly what I would want them to be, I guess. So I'm probably in future streams, I will probably put Sato and Moriko on the screen instead of spinning Pumpkin Kaisen, just because it's a little bit more appropriate for the holidays. But do let me know if you guys have any more suggestions on what you want to see as like little gifts for the seasons, or stuff you want to see as like my OCs to be in for objects and stuff. It could be like Masaki in an acorn, a maple leaf, a clover, that kind of stuff. And I'll definitely consider it for another session, or I'll just make a surprise one for the next live stream or something like that. But hopefully you guys enjoyed watching today's video of me doing little silly gifts for my OCs, kind of doing spinning sequences and stuff. I'll definitely finish off the Kaisen one at some point, because I want to play around with his sequence a little bit more. But I think that's it for today's video. Yeah, thank you for coming along with me as I make these small little silly gifts, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!